Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Are y'all ready for another Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast? I hope you all are, because I am, and we're diving basically right on in to right where we left off, which is we're diving into the RPG subgenres. Actually, these subgenres, instead of the usual, let's go over the genre of the RPG. And so, without further ado, we are going to be diving right back in. So, first off, we are going to give a quick overview once again of the RPG before we dive into what we've got. So, role-playing video games draw their gameplay from traditional tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Most of these games cast the player in the role of character that grows in strength and experience over the course of the game. By overcoming difficult challenges and or defeating monsters, the player gains experience points which represent the character's progress in a chosen profession or class, such as melee combatant or ranged magic spells, and allows the player to gain new abilities once a set amount are obtained. Many RPGs contain an open world known as an overworld, which is usually populated with monsters that allow access to get more important game locations such as towns, dungeons, and castles. Since the emergence of affordable home computers coincided with the popularity of pen and pencil role-playing games, this genre was one of the first in video games and continues to be popular today. Gameplay elements strongly associated with RPG, such as statistical character development through the acquisition of experience points, have been widely adapted to other genres, such as action-adventure games, though nearly all of the early entries in the game were turn-based games. Many modern role-playing games progress in real time. Thus, the genre has followed the strategy games trend of moving from turn-based to real-time combat. The move to real-time combat began with the release of Square's, now Square Enix's, Final Fantasy IV, which was the first game in the Final Fantasy series to use the Active Time Battle, or ATB, system. This was quickly followed by truly real-time action role-playing games such as the Mana series, Soul Blazer, and Ultima 7. Although older turn-based systems still exist, such as the Golden Sun series for Game Boy Advance, as well as Pokemon, and of course, Dragon Quest, also turn-based. So last week, we finished up the role-playing video games genre, and we did the action role-playing game genre. So now, we are going to open up with the open world subgenre. This is more of a mechanic, but people really kind of classify games as an open world game, which really just kind of classifies it as a almost a subgenre at that point. So it's worth a mention because it's a style and way to play, and basically everything about it says, hey, this is it. But anyway, in video games, an open world is a game mechanic of using a virtual world that the player can explore and approach objectives freely, as opposed to a world with more linear and structured gameplay. While games have used open world designs since the 1980s, the implementation of Grand Theft Auto 3 from 2001 set a standard that has been used since. Games with open or free roaming worlds typically lack structures like walls and locked doors, or the invisible walls in more open areas that prevent the player from venturing beyond them. Only at the bounds of an open world game will players be limited by geographic features like vast oceans or impassable mountains. Or in some cases, you can sail right off the edge of the world and suddenly find yourself on the other edge of the world. Bam! True open world right there. Players typically do not encounter loading screens common in linear level designs when moving about the game world. With the open world game using strategic storage and memory techniques to load the game world in a dynamic and seamless manner. Open world games still enforce many restrictions in the game environment, either because of the absolute technical limitations or in-game limitations imposed by a game's linearity. While the openness of the game worlds is an important facet to games featuring open worlds, the main draw of open world games is about providing the player with autonomy, not so much the freedom to do anything they want in the game, which is nearly impossible with current computing technology, but the ability to choose how to approach the game and its challenges in the order and manner as the player desires while still constrained by gameplay rules. Examples of high level of autonomy in computer games can be found in massively multiplayer online role-playing games, or MMORPG, or in single-player games adhering to the open-world concepts such as the Fallout series. The main appeal of open-world gameplay is that they provide a simulated reality and allow players to develop their character and its behavior in the direction and the pace that they're choosing. In these cases, there's often no concrete goal or endgame, although there may be the main storyline, such as the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which we will eventually play. Gameplay and design. An open world is a level or game designed as non-linear, open areas with many ways to reach an objective. Some games are designed with both traditional and open world levels. An open world facilitates greater exploration than a series of smaller levels, or a level with more linear challenges. Reviewers have judged the quality of an open world based on whether there are interesting ways for the player to interact with a broader level when they ignore their main objective. Some games actually use real settings to model an open world, such as New York City. A major design challenge is to balance the freedom of an open world with the structure of a dramatic storyline. Since players may perform actions that the game designer did not expect, the game writers must find creative ways to impose a storyline on the player without interfering with their freedom. As such, games with open worlds will sometimes break the story into a series of missions, or have a much simpler storyline altogether. Other games instead offer side missions to the player that do not disrupt the main storyline. Most open-world games make the character a blank slate that the player can project their own thoughts onto, although several games such as Stalker or The Treasures of King Noel offer more character development and dialogue. Written in 2005, David Braben described the narrative structure of current video games as little different to the stories of those Harold Lloyd films of the 1920s, and considered genuinely open-ended stories to be the holy grail we are looking for in the fifth generation of gameplay. Game designer Manveer Ayer, who worked on Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect Andromeda for EA, said there are difficulties in the design of an open-world game, since it is difficult to predict how the players will approach solving gameplay challenges offered by a design in contrast to a linear progression. It needs to be a factor in the game's development from the onset. Ayer opined that some of the critical failings of Andromeda were due to the open world being added late in development, which is very true. Some open world games, to guide the player towards major story events, do not provide the world's entire map at the start of the game, but require the player to complete a task to obtain part of the map, often identifying missions and points of interest when they view the map. This has been derogatorily referred to as Ubisoft Towers, as this mechanic was promoted in Assassin's Creed series, with the player climbing a large tower to observe the landscape around it and identify waypoints nearby, and reused in other Ubisoft games, including Far Cry, Might and Magic 10, Legacy, and Watch Dogs. Other games that use this approach include Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, and Breath of the Wild. You guys already heard my rant on that. Games with open worlds typically give players infinite lives or continues, although some force the player to start from the beginning should they die too many times. There's also a risk that players may get lost as they explore an open world, thus designers sometimes try to break the open world into manageable sections. The scope of the open world games The scope of open world games requires the developer to fully detail every possible section of the world the player may be able to access. Unless methods like procedural generation are used, the design process, due to its scale, may leave numerous game world glitches, bugs, incomplete sections, or other irregularities that players may find and potentially take advantage of. The term open world jank has been used to apply to games where the incorporation of the open world gameplay elements may be poor, incomplete, or unnecessary to the game itself, such that these glitches and bugs become more apparent, though generally not game breaking, such as the case for No Man's Sky near its launch. So, open world, sandbox, and emergent gameplay. The mechanics of open world games are often overlapped with ideas of sandbox games, but these are considered different terms. Whereas open world refers to the lack of limits for the player's exploration of the game's world, sandbox games are based on the ability of giving the player tools to for creative freedom within the game to approach objectives, if such objectives are present. For example, Microsoft Flight Simulator is an open-world game as one can fly anywhere within the mapped world, but is not considered a sandbox game as there are a few creative aspects brought into the game. The combination of open world and sandbox mechanics can lead towards emergent gameplay, complex reactions that emerge, either expectedly or unexpectedly, from the interaction of relatively simple game mechanics. According to Peter Molyneux, emergent gameplay appears whenever a game has a good simulation system that allows players to play with the world and have it respond realistically to their actions. It is what made SimCity and The Sims compelling to players. Similarly, being able to freely interact with the city's inhabitants in GTA, Grand Theft Auto, added an extra dimension to the series. In recent years, game designers have attempted to encourage emergent play by providing players with tools to expand games through their own actions. Examples include in-game web browsers in EVE Online and The Matrix Online, XML integration tools and programming languages in Second Life, shifting exchange rates in Entropia Universe, and the complex object and grammar system used to solve puzzles in Scribblenauts. Other examples of emergence include interactions between physics and artificial intelligence. One challenge that remains to be solved, however, is how to tell a compelling story using only emergent technology. In an op-ed piece for the BBC News, David Braben, co-creator of Elite, called truly open-ended game design the holy grail of modern gaming, citing games like Elite and the GTA series as early steps in that direction. Peter Molyneux has also stated that he believes emergence, or emergent gaming, is where video game development is headed to in the future. He has attempted to implement open-world gameplay to a great extent in some of his games, particularly Black and White and Fable. Procedural generation of open worlds. Procedural generation refers to content created or generated algorithmically rather than manually, and is often used to generate game levels and other content. While procedural generation does not guarantee that a game or sequence of levels is non-linear, it is an important factor in reducing game development time and opens up avenues, making it possible to generate larger and more or less unique seamless game worlds on the fly and using fewer resources. The kind of procedural generation is known as world building, in which general rules are used to construct a believable world. Most 4X and roguelike games make use of procedural generation to some extent to generate some game levels. A good example of that would be, if you remember my The Binding of Isaac, all they had to do was design like 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 rooms. That was it. And then the game will just puzzle piece them together. And that's it. Even then, they probably didn't even have to design those. They just had to put some rules in place and let the game design it themselves. SpeedTree is an example of a developer-oriented tool used in the development of The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, and aimed at speeding up the level design process. Procedural generation also made it possible for the developers of Elite, David Braben and Ian Bell, to fit the entire game including thousands of planets, dozens of trade commodities, multiple ship types, and a plausible economic system, into less than 22 kilobytes of memory. More recently, No Man's Skies procedurally generated over 18 quintillion planets, including flora, fauna, and other features that can be researched and explored. So how many zeros is a quintillion? So 100, 1,000, million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, 31 zeros, give or take. Give or take 1 0. That doesn't make sense. 21, sorry. I forgot where I was. Anyway, so the history of the open world, which is obviously began in the 20th century. There's no consensus on what the earliest open world game is due to differing definition of how large an open world needs to be. Inverse provides some early example games that establish elements of the open world. Jet Rocket, a 1970 Sega electromechanical arcade game that, while not a video game, predated the flight simulator genre to give the player free roaming capabilities. And D&D, a 1975 text-based adventure game for the Plato system that offered nonlinear gameplay. Ars Technica traces the concept back to the free roaming exploration of the 1976 text adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure, which inspired the free roaming exploration of adventure, which came out in 1980. But notes that it was not until 1984 that what we now know as open world gaming took on a definite shape with the 1984 space simulator Elite, which was considered a pioneer of the open world genre. Gamasutra argues that its open-ended sandbox style is rooted in flight simulators, such as Sublogic's Flight Simulator 1979-1980, noting most flight sims offer a free light mode that allows players to simply pilot the craft and explore the virtual world. Others trace the concept back to 1981's CRPG Ultima, which had a free-roaming overworld map inspired by tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons. The overworld maps of the first 5 Ultimate games, released up to 1988, lacked a single unifying scale, with towns and other places represented as icons. This style was adopted by the first 3 Dragon Quest games, released from 1986 to 1988 in Japan. Early examples of an open-world gameplay and adventure games include the Portopia Serial Murder Case, 1983, and The Lords of Midnight, 1984, with open-world elements also found in The Hobbit, 1982, and Valhalla, 1983. The strategy video game The Seven Cities of Gold, 1984, is also cited as an early open-world game, influencing Sid Meier's Pirates, 1987. Eurogamer also cites British computer games such as Ant Attack and Saber Wolf as early examples. According to Game Informer's Kyle Hilliard, Hydlide 1984 and The Legend of Zelda 1986 were among the first open-world games along with Ultima. IGN traces the roots of open-world game design to The Legend of Zelda, which it argues is the first really good game based on exploration, while noting that it was anticipated by Hydlide, which it argues is the first RPG that rewarded exploration. According to GameSpot, never had a game so open-ended, non-linear, and liberating been released from the mainstream market with The Legend of Zelda. According to The Escapist, The Legend of Zelda was an early example of open-world non-linear gameplay with an expansive and cohesive world, inspiring many games to adopt a similar open-world design. Mercenary, 1985, has been cited as the first open-world 3D action-adventure game. There are also other open-world games in the 1980s, such as Back to School, 1985, Turbo Esprit, 1986, and Alternate Reality, The City, 1985. Wasteland, released in 1988, is also considered an open-world game. The early 1990s saw open-world games such as The Terminator, 1990, The Adventures of Robin Hood, 91, and Hunter, 91, which IGN describes as the first sandbox game to feature full 3D, third-person graphics, and Ars Technica argues has one of the strongest claims to the title of GTA forebear. Sierra Online's 1992 adventure game King's Quest VI has an open world. Almost half of the quests are optional. Many have multiple solutions, and players can solve most in any order. Quarantine, 1994, is an example of an open-world driving game from this period, while Iron Soldier, 1994, is an open-world mech game. The director of Blade Runner argues that that game was the first open-world three-dimensional action-adventure game. IGN considers Nintendo's Super Mario 64 revolutionary for its 3D, open-ended, free-roaming worlds, which had rarely been seen in 3D before, along with its analog stick controls and camera control. Other 3D examples include Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, Ocarina of Time, the DMA design game Body Harvest, Midtown Madness, and Midnight Club Street Racing, Driver, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and Banjo-Tooie are all other examples of 3D games. 1UP considers Sega's adventure Shenmue, the originator of the Open City subgenre, touted as a free, full reactive eyes entertainment game. Haha, see, get it? It's a free game, but it's a full reactive eyes entertainment. Horrible marketing. Giving players the ability to explore an expansive sandbox city with its own day-night cycles, changing weather, and fully voiced NPCs going about their daily routine. The game's large interactive environments, wealth of options, level of detail, and the scope of its urban sandbox exploration has been compared to later sandbox games like GTA 3 and its sequels, Sega's own Yakuza series, Fallout 3, and Deadly Premonition. Then, of course, moving into the 21st century, GTA has had over 200 million sales. Creative director Gary Penn, who had previously worked on Frontier Elite 2, cited Elite as a key influence, calling it basically Elite in a city, and mentioned other team members being influenced by Syndicate and Mercenary. GTA 3 combined elements from previous games, fused them together into a new immersive 3D experience that helped define open-world games for a new generation. Executive producer Sam Houser described it as Zelda meets Goodfellas, which producer Dan Houser also cited Legend of Zelda and Super Mario 64 as influences. Radio stations had been implemented earlier in games, such as Max's Simcopter, 1996. The ability to beat or kill non-player characters dates back to Portopia, 1983, and Valhalla, 83. And the way in which players run over pedestrians and get chased by the police has been compared to Pac-Man. After the release of GTA 3, many games which employed a 3D open world, such as Watch Dogs and Saints Row, were labeled often disparagingly as GTA clones, much as how many early first-person shooters were called Doom clones. Other examples include World of Warcraft, the Elder Scrolls, and Fallout series of games, which features a large and diverse world, offering tasks and possibilities to play. In the Assassin's Creed series, which began in 2007, players explore historic open-world settings. These include the Holy Land during the Crusades, Renaissance Rome, New England during the American Revolution, the Caribbean during the Golden Age of piracy, Paris during the French Revolution, London during the height of the Industrial Revolution, ancient Egypt and Greece during the Peloponnesian War. The series intertwines factual history with a fictional storyline. In the fictional storyline, the Templars and Assassins have been mortal enemies for all of known history. Their conflict stems from the Templars' desire to have peace through the control, which directly contrasts the assassins' wish for peace with free will. Their fighting influences much of history, as the sides often back real historical forces. For example, during the American Revolution, depicted in Assassin's Creed 3, the Templars often support the British while the assassins side with the American colonists. Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, was developed by GSC Game World in 2007, followed by 2 other games, a prequel and a sequel. The free world style of the zone was divided into huge maps like sectors, and players can go from one sector to another depending on required quests or just by choice. 2011, Dan Reichert of Game Informer wrote that open-world crime games were a major force in the gaming industry for the preceding decade. Another popular open-world sandbox game is Minecraft, which has sold over 122 million copies worldwide on multiple platforms by February of 2017. Minecraft's procedurally generated overworlds cover a virtual 3.6 billion square kilometers. The Altera engine is a world rendering engine in development since 2008 that is capable of seamlessly rendering whole planets from space down to ground level. Anti-World is a world-building game and free tech demo of the Altera engine that builds upon real-world data to render planet Earth realistically on a true-to-life scale. That's actually kind of impressive. No Man's Sky, released in 2016, is an open-world game set in a virtually infinite universe. According to developers, through procedural generation, the game is able to produce more than 18 quintillion planets, which is 8 times 10 to the 15th power, or 18, 000, 000, 000, 000, 000, 000 planets to explore. Several critics found that the nature of the game can be repetitive and monotonous, with the survival gameplay elements being lackluster and tedious. Jake Swearingen in New York said, "You can procedurally generate 18.6 quintillion unique planets, but you can't procedurally generate 18.6 quintillion unique things to do." Subsequent updates made post-release have since aimed to address those criticisms. In 2017, the open-world design of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has been described by critics as being revolutionary, and by developers as a paradigm shift for open-world design. In contrast to the more structured approach of most open-world games, Breath of the Wild features a large and fully interactive world that is generally unstructured and rewards the exploration and manipulation of its world. Inspired by the original 1986 Legend of Zelda, the open world of Breath of the Wild integrates multiplicative gameplay, where objects react to the player's actions and objects themselves also influence each other. Along with a physics engine, the game's open world also integrates a chemistry engine, which governs the physical properties of certain objects and how they relate to each other, rewarding experimentation. Nintendo has described the game's approach to open world design as open air. And that right there is the open world subgenre. And now we're going to dive in to the MMORPG, the massively multiplayer online role-playing game subgenre. The type of subgenre that I would love to dive into, but I sadly cannot because I cannot pay the constant monthly subscription. Okay. A massively multiplayer online role-playing game is a video game that combines aspects of a role-playing video game and a massively multiplayer online game. As in regular RPGs, a player assumes the role of a character, often in a fantasy world or a science fiction world, and takes control over many of that character's actions. MMORPGs are distinguished from single-player or small multiplayer online RPGs by the number of players able to interact together. by the game's persistent world, usually hosted by the game's publisher, which continues to exist and evolve while the player is offline and away from the game. MMORPGs are played throughout the world. Worldwide revenues for MMORPGs exceeded $500 million in 2005, and Western revenues exceeded $1 billion in 2006. I can only imagine how much MMORPGs made in 2020. In 2008, the spending on subscription MMORPGs by consumers in North America and Europe grew to $1.4 billion. World of Warcraft, a popular MMORPG, had over 10 million subscribers as of November of 2014. World of Warcraft's total revenue was $1.04 billion in 2014. Star Wars: The Old Republic, released in 2011, became the world's fastest growing MMO ever, after gaining more than 1 million subscribers within the first 3 days of its launch. I actually got into the beta for Star Wars: The Old Republic. Fun fact. So, common features. Although modern MMORPGs sometimes differ dramatically from its predecessors, many of them share the same basic characteristics. These include several common features: persistent game environment, some form of level progression, social interaction within the game, in-game culture, system architecture, membership in a group, and character customization. Themes. The majority of popular MMORPGs are based on traditional fantasy themes, often occurring in an in-game universe comparable to that of Dungeons & Dragons. Some employ hybrid themes that either emerge or replace fantasy elements with those of science fiction, sword, sorcery, or crime fiction. Others draw thematic material from American comic books, the occult, and other genres. These elements are often developed using similar tasks and scenarios involving quests, monsters, and loot. Progression. In nearly all MMORPGs, the development of the player's character is the primary goal. Nearly all MMORPGs feature a character progression system in which players earn experience points for their actions and use those points to reach character levels, which makes them better at whatever they do. Traditionally, combat with monsters and completing quests for NPCs, either alone or in groups, are the primary ways to earn experience points. The accumulation of wealth, including combat-useful items, is also a way to progress in many MMORPGs. This is traditionally best accomplished via combat. The cycle produced by these conditions, combat leading to new items, allowing for more combat with no change in gameplay, is sometimes pejoratively referred to as the level treadmill, or grinding. I kind of like level treadmill more than grinding. Hey guys, I'm gonna go hit the level treadmill for a bit. The role-playing game Progress Quest was created as a parody of this trend. EVE Online trains skills in real time rather than using experience points as a measure of progress. In some MMORPGs, there is no limit to a player's level, allowing the grinding experience to continue indefinitely. MMORPGs that use this model often glorify top-ranked players by displaying their avatars on the game's website or posting their stats on a high score screen. Another common practice is to enforce a maximum reachable level for all players, often referred to as a level cap. Once reached, the definition of a player's progression changes. Instead of being rewarded primarily with experience for completing quests and dungeons, the player's motivation to continue playing will be replaced with collecting money and equipment. Often, the widened range of equipment available at the maximum level will have increased aesthetic value to distinguish high-ranking players in the game being lower ranked. Colloquially known as endgame gear, this set of overpowered, empowered weapons and armor adds a competitive edge to both scripted boss encounters as well as player versus player combat. Player motivation to outperform others is fueled by acquiring such items and is a significant determining factor in their success or failure in combat-related situations. Social integration. MMORPGs almost always have tools to facilitate communication between players. Many MMORPGs often offer support for in-game guilds or clans, though these will usually form whether the game supports them or not. In addition, most MMOGs require some degree of teamwork in parts of these games. These tasks usually require players to take roles in a group, such as protecting other players from damage, called tanking, healing damage done to other players, or damaging enemies. MMORPGs generally have game moderators or game masters, frequently referred to as GMs or mods, who may be paid employees or unpaid volunteers who attempt to supervise the worlds. Some GMs have additional access to features and information related to the game that are not available to other players and roles. Relationships formed in MMORPGs can often be just as intense as relationships formed between friends or partners met outside of the game, and often involve elements of collaboration and trust between players. Role-playing. Most MMORPGs provide different types of classes that players can choose. Among those classes, a small portion of players choose to roleplay their characters, and there are roles that provide functionality and content to those who do. Community of resources such as forums and guides exist in support of this playstyle. For example, if a player wants to play a priest role in his MMORPG role, he might buy a cope from a shop and learn priestly skills, proceeding to speak, act, and interact with others as their character would. This may or may not include pursuing other goals such as wealth or experience. Guilds or similar groups will focus on role-playing, may develop extended, in-depth narratives using the settings and resources similar to those in the game world. Culture. Over time, the MMORPG community has developed a subculture with its own slang and metaphors, as well as an unwritten list of social rules and taboos. Players will often complain about the level treadmill, a slang term for any repetitive, time-consuming activity in an MMORPG, and talk about buffs or nerfs, respectively an upgrade or downgrade of a particular game mechanic. As with all such cultures, social rules exist for such things as invitations to join an adventuring party, the proper division of treasure, and how a player is expected to behave while grouped with other players. There is a debate in various gaming media over the long-term effect of video game overuse. That's hogwash. System architecture. Most MMORPGs are deployed using a client-server system architecture. The server system generates a persistent instance of the virtual world that runs continuously, and players connect to it via a client software. The client software may provide access to the entire playing world, or further expansions may be required to be purchased to allow certain areas of the game. EverQuest and Guild Wars are two examples of games that use such a format. Players generally must purchase the client software for a one-time fee, although an increasing trend is for MMORPGs to work using pre-existing thin clients, such as a web browser, like RuneScape. Actually, RuneScape has gone from being solely a browser-based game to you can download it for free on Steam. Since MMORPGs require payment or a monthly subscription to play, by definition, massively multiplayer games are always online and must require some sort of continuous revenue, such as monthly subscriptions and advertisements, for maintenance and development purposes. Some games, such as Guild Wars, have disposed of the monthly fee model entirely and recover costs directly through sales of the software and associated expansion packs. Still, others adopt a micropayment model where the core content is free, but players are given the option to purchase additional content, such as equipment, aesthetic items, or pets. Games that make use of that model are often have originated in Korea, such as Fliff and MapleStory. The business model is alternatively called pay for perks or freemium, and games using it often describe themselves with the term free to play. So, the reason I played RuneScape a lot and like RuneScape more than a lot of the other ones is because it is a free to play game. But it also has a monthly subscription because I'd say 70% of the game is locked behind that. There is free quests, there is free end game, and there's an entire free portion of the map. but the amount of quests you can do, the amount of skills you can learn and hone, and the locations you can go are all limited to that free path. It's supposed to be that taste, that little bit of, ooh, I like this, I want more, so I will pay $20 to be a member. Meh. I got enough of it, playing it for free. Depending on the number of players in the system architecture, an MMORPG might be run on multiple separate servers, each representing an independent world, where players from one server cannot interact with those from another. World of Warcraft is a prominent example, with each separate server housing several thousand players. In many MMORPGs, the number of players in one world is often limited to around a few thousand, but a notable example of the opposite is EVE Online, which accommodates several 100,000 players on the same server, with over 60,000 playing simultaneously in June of 2010 at certain times. Some games allow characters to appear on any world, but not simultaneously, such as Seal Online Evolution. Others limit each character to the world in which it was created. A World of Warcraft has experimented with cross-realm, a cross-server, interaction in player-versus-player battlegrounds, using server clusters or battle groups to coordinate players looking to participate in structured PvP content, such as the Warsong Gulch or Alterac Valley Battlegrounds. Additionally, patch 3.3, released on December 8, 2009, introduced a cross-realm looking for group system to help players form groups for instanced content, though not for open world questing, from a larger pool of characters than their home server can generally provide. History. MMORPG is a term coined by Richard Garriott to refer to massively multiplayer online role-playing games and their social communities. Previous to this and related coinages, these games were generally called graphical MUDs. The history of MMORPGs traces back directly through the MUD genre, which is what we're going to be looking at next week, the MUD. Through this connection, MMORPGs can be seen to have roots in the earliest multi-user games such as Maze War and MUD 1, 1974 and 1978 respectively. 1985 saw the release of a roguelike pseudo-graphical MUD called Island of Kesma on CompuServe, and Lucasfilm's graphical MUD Habitat. The first fully graphical multi-user RPG was Neverwinter Night, which was delivered through America Online in 1991, and was personally championed by AOL President Steve Case. Other early proprietary graphical online RPGs include 3 of the Sierra Network, The Shadow of Cerberus in 1992, The Fates of Twinian in 1993, and The Ruins of Cawdor in 1995. Another milestone came in 1995 as NSFNET restrictions were lifted, opening the internet up for game developers, which allowed for the first truly massively scoped titles. Finally, MMORPGs as defined today began with Meridian 59 in 1996. Innovative both in its scope and in offering first-person 3D graphics, with The Realm Online appearing nearly simultaneously. Ultima Online, released in 1997, is often credited with first popularizing the genre, though more mainstream attention was garnered in 1999's EverQuest and Asheron's Call in the West, and 1996's Nexus, The Kingdom of the Winds in South Korea. The financial success of these early titles has ensured competition in the genre since that time. MMORPG titles now exist on consoles and in new settings. As of 2008, the market for MMORPGs has Blizzard Entertainment's World of Warcraft dominating as the largest MMORPG, alongside other titles such as Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2. Though an additional market exists for free-to-play MMORPGs, which are supported by advertising and purchases of in-game items. This free-to-play model is particularly common in South Korea, such as MapleStory, Rohan Blood Feud, and Atlantica Online. Also, there are some free-to-play games such as RuneScape and Tibia, where the game is free, but one would have to pay monthly to play the game with most of its features. Guild Wars and its sequel avoid some degree of competition with other MMORPGs by only requiring the initial purchase of the game to play. Now, I'll be honest. If Final Fantasy XIV followed Guild Wars, and I could buy the base game and then buy expansions all separately, yeah, I'd do that. But I don't want to pay $20 a month when there's the possibility that I can't play, like, what if I can't play 2 weekends in a row for my Final Fantasy Saturday? Then I'm losing money in terms of, like, gameplay to cost. Generally, I've probably said this many times before, but the way I view a deal is $1 for every hour I play in a game. So if I buy a game for $50, I want to spend 50 hours in the game to say I spent my money well. What I don't want is a game that costs $50, is beaten in 5 hours, and it has no reason for me to go back to it. You know? Like, that's probably why I love RPGs the most. Because there's so much content. You know? The best 2 examples would be Dragon Age Inquisition and Dragon Quest XI. Inquisition I picked up for $20. We've been playing that thing for like 60 hours. Dragon Quest XI I picked up for $50. According to most normies who don't understand Dragon Quest, to get the true ending takes over 100 hours. I can still beat it in 60. It just depends on how fast or how slow I go. But that's just my view, you know? It's like, if you're going to play a game a lot, you know, spending that extra $10, it's fine. If you don't think you're going to play it that much and you're not like, I got to have it now, just wait. You know, $1 an hour. It's a really good way of saying, is this game worth it? Am I going to play with it a lot? So, development. The cost of developing a competitive commercial MMORPG title often exceeded $10 million in 2003. These projects require multiple disciplines within game design and development, such as 3D modeling, 2D art, animation, user interfaces, client and server engineering, database architecture, and network infrastructure. The front-end, or client, component of a commercial modern MMORPG features 3D graphics. As with other modern 3D games, the front end requires expertise with implementing 3D engines, real-time shader techniques, and physics simulation. The actual visual content, areas, characters, weapons, spaceships, and so forth, is developed by artists who typically begin with 2-dimensional concept art and later convert these concepts into animated 3D scenes, models, and texture maps. Developing an MMOG server requires expertise with client-server architecture, network protocols, security, and database design. MMORPGs include reliable systems for a number of vital tasks. The server must be able to handle and verify a large number of connections, prevent cheating, and apply changes, bug fixes, or added content to the game. A system for recording the game's data at regular intervals without stopping the game is also important. Maintenance requires sufficient servers and bandwidth, and a dedicated support staff. Insufficient resources for maintenance lead to lag and frustration for the players and can severely damage the reputation of a game, especially at launch. Care must be taken to ensure that player population remains at an acceptable level by adding or removing servers. Peer-to-peer MMORPGs could theoretically work cheaper cheaply and effectively in regulating server load, but practical issues such as asymmetrical network bandwidth, CPU-hungry rendering engines, unreliability of individual nodes, and inherent lack of security, open fertile new grounds for cheating, can make them a difficult proposition. The hosted infrastructure for a commercial-grade MMORPG requires the deployment of hundreds or even thousands of servers. Developing an affordable infrastructure for an online game requires developers to scale large numbers of players with less hardware and network investment. In addition, the development team will need to have expertise with the fundamentals of game design, world building, lore, and game mechanics, as well as what makes games fun, the usual. Non-corporate development. Though the vast majority of MMORPGs are produced by companies, many small teams of programmers and artists have contributed to the genre. As shown above, the average MMORPG development project requires enormous investment of time and money, and running the game can be a long-term commitment. As a result, non-corporate or independent or indie development of MMORPGs is less common compared to other genres. Still, many independent MMORPGs do exist, representing a wide spectrum of genres, gameplay types, and revenue systems. For example, there is a free-to-play open-source MMORPG called Rhizome, Rhyzom. Let's see. Okay, we can take a look at that in a minute. Some independent MMORPG projects are completely open source, while others feature proprietary content made with an open source game engine. The World Forge project has been active since 1998 and formed a community of independent developers who are working on creating framework for a number of open source MMORPGs. The Multiverse Foundation has also created a platform specifically for independent MMORPG developers. Wow, we're not going to be able to finish this today. So we're going to hit trends and then look at Rhizome, and that'll be it for today. Trends. As there are a number of wildly different titles within the genre, since the genre develops so rapidly, it is difficult to definitively state that the genre is headed in one direction or another. Still, there are obvious developments. There are a few obvious developments. One of these developments is the Raid Group Quest, or Raid, which is an adventure designed for large groups of players, often 20 or more. Instance Dungeons. Instance Dungeons, sometimes shortened to Instance, are game areas that are copied for individual players or groups, which keeps those in the instance separated from the rest of the game world. This reduces competitions and also reducing the amount of data that needs to be sent to and from the server, reducing lag. The Realm Online, which was the first MMORPG to begin to use a rudimentary form of this technique, and Anarchy Online would develop it further, using instances as a key element of the gameplay. Since then, instancing has become increasingly common. The raids, as mentioned above, involve instance dungeons, examples of games which feature instances like World of Warcraft, the Lord of the Rings Online, EverQuest, EverQuest 2, Aeon, Final Fantasy XIV, Guild Wars, Rift, RuneScape, Star Trek Online, Star Wars, The Old Republic, and DC Universe Online. So a good example of what an instance is, say you're doing a solo quest, and it's a fairly easy boss that you can farm over and over and over again, but you're afraid that some other user is going to come in and steal. Well, you see like 5 people enter the cave, and you're like, well, I got nothing else to do, so you enter the cave as well. Nobody is there. Why? Because you are in your own instance of that cave. That's to prevent people from loot ninja-ing, from kill stealing, which is... Kill stealing is where like you do 99% of damage, but somebody has like a really quick spell that does just enough damage to take that other 1% away. So therefore, they're credited with a kill, you're credited with nothing, and they get to steal your loot. Yeah. Player-created content. Increased amounts of player-created content is another trend. Use of licenses. The use of intellectual property licensing, common in other video game genres, has also appeared in MMORPGs. 2007 saw the release of The Lord of the Rings Online, based on J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. Other licensed MMORPGs include The Matrix Online, based on the Matrix trilogy of films, Warhammer Online: Age of Reckoning, based on Games Workshop's tabletop game, Star Wars Galaxies, Star Wars The Old Republic, Champions Online, and Age of Conan. Additionally, several licenses from television have been opined for MMORPGs. For example, Star Trek Online and Stargate Worlds, which was later canceled. Console-based MMORPGs. The first console-based MMORPG was Phantasy Star Online, that's fantasy with a PH, for the Sega Dreamcast. The first console-based open world MMORPG was Final Fantasy XI for the PlayStation 2. EverQuest Online Adventures, also on the PlayStation 2, was the first console MMORPG in North America. Although console-based MMORPGs are considered more difficult to produce, the platform is gaining more attention. Then there's browser-based MMORPGs. With the popularization of Facebook and microtransaction has come a new wave of Flash and HTML5-based MMORPGs that use the free-to-play model. They require no download outside of a browser and usually have heavily integrated social media sharing features. Smartphone-based MMORPGs. Smartphones, with their GPS capabilities among others, enable augmented reality in games such as Ingress and PokéGo. The games are enhanced by location and distance based on tracking, benchmarking goals, and facilitating trade between players. All right, next week we're going to hit the last 2 points, which is society and culture with psychological effects and economics. But first, we're going to look at Rhizome, which is a free-to-play, 100% free-to-play indie development MMORPG. So, Rhizome, also known as the Saga of Rhizome, is a free and open-source, massively multiplayer online role-playing game developed by Neverax for Windows. So, Rhizome features open-world gameplay. Instead of character classes, it has a unique system for character abilities that allow players to construct custom actions like spells or attacks in detail. The game world is complex, modeled, incorporating realistic effects like changing weather and seasons. Computer-controlled entities, or mobs, display complex behaviors, and animals will, for example, graze in herds or hunt in packs. Rhizome offers a scenario editor that lets players design their own areas that can be uploaded and played on the official server. Let's see, so the skill system. Each character gains levels independently in the fields of weapon-oriented fighting, magic, crafting, and harvesting, simply performing appropriate action, killing enemies with a sword for fighting, assembling jewelry for crafting. Each level gained in one of those fields awards the characters 10 skill points that can be spent on new abilities specific to that field, on general character improvements, or simply just saved for later. As a character progresses in levels, the skills become more refined. For example, a starting character casting spells would acquire points in the skill called Magic. After level 20, points are accumulated into either offensive magic or defensive magic, and attack spells will add more points to the former, while healing spells add to the latter. At later levels, there are also split, allowing higher level characters to more formally specialize. All player actions are built on components called stanzas. Each stanza defines one of the action's effects, costs, or usage restrictions. Players may assemble actions out of any legal combination of stanzas that their character knows. Components of crafting come from the corpses of killed animals or from hidden resource deposits scattered throughout the world of Attis. Different ingredients provide varying benefits to different characteristics of the finished object. For example, when crafting a mace using a certain kind of animal bone for the head may produce a hard-hitting but slow weapon, while using a particular wood may produce a weapon that is fast and gives a large bonus to parrying enemies' attacks but causes less damage. Further complicating things is the fact that any ingredient may occur in one of 5 classes and with a quality from 1 to 250, all of which affect the attributes of the final product. Harvesting is a complex skill and sometimes team-oriented procedure. The player must first locate the desired materials using prospecting skills, as resources give no visible sign of their presence. If he does not have teammates to aid him, he may need to balance his work between extracting the resource and treating the extraction site to prevent it from collapsing prematurely or exploding. The site's location and the harvester's own skill level both affect the maximum possible quality of the extracted resource. So this game actually sounds incredibly interesting, and I might want to take a look for it. The game requires registration, but if you want to advance beyond level 125, you have to have a paid subscription. And each account can have up to 5 different characters. That's still pretty interesting. 125 levels for free. That's not bad. And if you've put in 125 hours, that kind of shows that you're more than willing to play the game. And it would be a good way for people to be like, do I actually like an MMORPG? It really allows you to just go in there and play. So, yeah, that's something for you all to take a look at should you ever want to. But I think that's where we're going to be leaving it off. We did not finish the massively multiplayer online role-playing game, but we will finish that next week, and then we will jump into the MUD, or the multi-user dungeon. That might take up all of next week, but if it doesn't, we will also be able to start the roguelike or the tactical role-playing. So, yeah. Thank you, everybody, for dropping by for this podcast. I hope you all enjoyed. And until the next time, everybody, stay funky, people.